what we basically focus on and what we're going to talk about is what you might want to consider as programming in the large for extreme scale parallel machines. And so when we talk about workflow, what we're talking about is the coordinated execution of scientific application codes, typically in their entirety. And we'll talk about that as a central theme for how this field and approach to coordination is evolving. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk very generally about workflow and sort of set the context with several application examples that demand this kind of approach to programming and actually to the conducting of computational science. And then we're going to, I'll briefly mention some of the many approaches that are being used today. And then we're going to dive deep into some of the approaches that are part of the research that goes on in our specific group in terms of applying a new language that has evolved out of research at Argonne and UChicago called Swift to this problem. And I think as we go through that in depth, we'll kind of see what the connection and applicability is for this. Okay, so as I said, workflow is the coordinated execution of multiple application codes. So we're typically taking scientific applications, be they parallel or serial, and whether they're and they could be expressed in a wide variety of programming models. Serial, in a wide variety of languages, everything from traditional C, C++, Fortran programming languages, all the way to scripting languages or higher level languages like Python and MATLAB that are sometimes sort of span the border between application programming languages and scripting. Or they could be parallel programs expressed in MPI, OpenMP, global arrays, any of the new evolving PGAS languages that you've been introduced to or are already using. And so these application codes are often stitched together to form a larger scale scientific programming campaign. In other words, a scientist often has a large collection of data to analyze or a large simulation campaign to conduct, and it involves running tens to hundreds to thousands of invocations of these kinds of scientific codes over a period that could be anywhere from minutes to hours to months. And so workflow kind of spans all of those kinds of models. It's in some cases it's used to coordinate a day's worth of execution to conduct a parameter sweep or to explore a large data set. And in some cases it's workflow that sort of spans many sort of stop-start activities. In other words, having to run millions of simulations over a period of many months and having to track where you are in that process. So workflow kind of encompasses that whole broad spectrum. So often when we talk about workflow, the typical approach to it is some kind of scripting language, because scripting by definition, and as kind of made famous in a pretty well-known paper by John Osterhout, the developer of Tickle and many other application tools. John Osterhout called scripting higher level programming for the 21st century, and that's indeed the notion of using scripting as a glue language to stitch together components that are created at various levels, library components, application components, scripts themselves into higher level things. Another common programming model that's associated with workflow is high throughput computing. So this was a name popularized by the Condor high throughput computing system back in the 80s. And it was the notion of basically running large numbers of jobs on various diverse aggregates of resources, whether they be unused desktops in an academic computing environment, or then later more formalized clusters in a high performance computing center. High throughput computing was used to denote typically the execution of rather long-running jobs and over a very long-running period of time. And then in the last, say, 5 years, as high-throughput computing met the supercomputing community, this term many-task computing evolved. And many-task was really trying to capture basically two different things. One is trying to capture the notion of this notion of assembling higher level functionality from discrete tasks. And the task model was typically send the input data to an application code, let it run to completion, take its output, send it to the next stage. So many-task computing kind of encompassed the notion of using that basic principle to assemble higher level workflows. But it also addressed the idea that the tasks that we're talking about in a given workflow can be not just something that runs for hours, but it could conceptually be something that runs for seconds or eventually just for milliseconds. So that the notion of granularity and sort of taking this higher level programming model and seeing how far downwards it could be made viable and useful was sort of the essence of the concept of many-task computing. And for many-task computing, it's caused many researchers in the field of coordination languages to kind of bring back a concept that sort of pops in and out of vogue and has been doing so literally since the late 70s. And this is the concept of dataflow. And in a sense, dataflow is sort of the attempt to try to create a transparent way to automatically detect when an application needs to be executed, and hence automate the scheduling and the parallelization and actually the data transport that's needed to stitch together a workflow. So the notion of data flow means that a task can be executed as soon as all of its input data products are ready, and that when it produces any output data products, any subsequent dependent tasks can automatically fire. So data flow is kind of implicitly this notion of automating the sequencing of job execution triggered by data availability. Okay? And then lastly, we often talk about things being data parallel or task parallel, and workflow naturally falls into the task parallel category. In other words, in workflow, we're typically focused on expressing the functional computing tasks necessary to get a given higher level job done, and the data flow is what connects those tasks. Whereas in data parallel computing, which is really the model that's driven probably most of your discussions since you've been here, you're really talking about a concept of taking the problem you're trying to program, decomposing it into a domain-based decomposition of mapping data to functional execution units, and then coordinating the execution of those functional units by various kinds of synchronization means. So in many task applications, we're basically creating ensembles that stitch together these independent tasks. So traditionally, many task computing started out by focusing on the notion of data passing via files. In other words, the inputs and outputs of every unit of execution in a higher level workflow is a file is produced by one task, written to a file system, be it local or shared, and then consumed by the downstream tasks. And it's also characterized typically by, or often by, applications that have many stages. And so what you typically often see in a traditional workflow is many stages that kind of mimic the concepts of map and reduce. In other words, map a series of related parallel tasks out to a set of resources, process them in parallel to the extent possible, bring them to a point where they can be summarized and then brought to the next stage of processing. So this notion of workflows comprising map-reduce stages is a very common pattern. And the thing that's kind of important as we talk about scaling this model upwards is the enormous task rates that can be generated as you start to apply the concepts of data flow and workflow to finer and finer granularity and finer levels of your application domain. Okay, so let's take a look at a few applications where this is where this model of many-task computing and workflows derived from that model are very applicable and appropriate. So here's an example of what often happens in many drug discovery contexts. So you've got a set of models of proteins that are related to some kind of health syndrome, typically, and then you have a large set of candidate compounds that the laboratory is typically looking for some kind of interaction with those proteins. So this results in kind of an explosive search through, in some sense, through data space. In other words, because I have a small number of ligands times, or small number of proteins times a very large number of chemical ligand compounds, and the multiplicity of those yields a vast number of simulations that need to be done to see how, computationally to simulate how those chemicals are going to interact with the protein. In other words, how does one molecule fit into the docking pocket of a given set of proteins? So there's an application, there's many application codes that do this kind of docking. This was an example of a study using a tool called Doc6, and it resulted in literally 1 million computing tasks. And what was interesting about them is they had kind of a fixed data input pattern. In other words, typically a 50 or so megabyte description of the protein and its docking pocket, and then ligand descriptions, chemical compound descriptions that were on the order of hundreds of kilobytes. And these docking tasks would vary very drastically in their duration. So they would run, in this particular study, they ran anywhere from around a minute to 45 minutes. So you had this kind of difficulty of trying to schedule all of these jobs and trying to identify, for example, the longest running jobs. If you could identify the longest running jobs in this kind of flow, you could start them at the beginning of a workflow, and they would be done by the time you ended, so that you wouldn't have very long-running stragglers that prevented you from getting the whole solution done. So that's the typical kind of problem that exists in that space. And another typical example is running the BLAST protein and DNA sequence searching and comparison tool. So very often in this case, you have a very large database of protein sequences, and you want to do things like, in some cases you want to do like a reciprocal search, like compare every protein sequence in that database to every other one. So basically if you have on the order of 6 to 8 million protein sequences in the some of the standard protein databases, that's a vast number of computations, and so it's like conceptually 8 million invocations of the BLAST tool, although these can be grouped in various ways. So this was a study that was basically doing a comparison between expressing this kind of workflow via MPI and expressing it via scripting tools using a many-task approach. And the findings of this was that using a very high-level scripting approach to this kind of problem was within a hair's breadth of the performance of a much more tedious MPI-based expression of this problem. So the interesting lesson behind that was that there's a lot of programming productivity that we can sort of elevate the way that we express these kinds of parallel flows by looking for high-level data flow-driven scripting methods to do this, and we can avoid some of the complexities of message-based programming or of programming complex multiprocessor synchronization because of the nature of the data flow. So this is a study of this comparison between BLAST coded as a many-task program and BLAST coded as a tightly coupled bound MPI job. So another driving example is to use workflow to do analysis of the output of very large simulations or of simulation ensembles. So this was a project that was looking at the Community Earth System model, the CESM family of models for ocean, air, atmosphere, et cetera, land. And what happens in these cases, we have these very large MPI codes that run climate models for days at a time and yield, on the order of, 50 terabytes or more for a given model run, and that number is just increasing as the resolution and fidelity of these climate models is going up. But when the climate model completed, the climate scientists still didn't have data that they could then use and study. What had to be done was analysis and diagnostic scripts were then run on the output of these climate models to do summarization and plotting and basically to sort of extract the signal out of the model. And these scripts, in the case of CESM, were basically expressed as very complex seashell scripts. So it's basically a form of workflow, but it's a implicitly serial form of workflow unless you're going to go and tediously look for parallelism and try to invoke ad hoc parallelism at the shell level. So in this example, higher level workflow tools were applied, and the community now has a data flow driven approach to running these analysis models or these analysis tools. So all of the diagnostic scripts for the CESM community were recoded using parallel data flow, and that's enabled the community to get a kind of a significant productivity boost in terms of reducing the amount of time from completion of a model to beginning of science from days to hours. So another domain where workflows are very common is in neuroscience. So a lot of neuroscience investigations are done either using functional MRI-based tools or EEG analysis tools. And a neuroscience experiment takes the form of a sort of a structured experiment with multiple human subjects, multiple conditions being tested, multiple sessions, and then even a given session inside a MRI scanner results in a data set that's kind of sort of a deep, complex directory structure of image and metadata output. And this, again, is a community that had typically done most of their processing via ad hoc scripting tools and heavily with shell tools. And so in neuroscience, a lot of effort has recently been done to, again, use data flow-based tools and also to use visually driven workflow tools to allow scientists to connect the very diverse application codes that are used to process these kinds of data structures and to sort of stitch them together visually and express their data flow processing with little or no programming. So we both have approaches that use higher level scripting languages and approaches that use visual scripting to do this kind of study. And then there's many other domains that lend itself to this. So for example, in the middle of the upper middle are some examples of theoretical chemists that are using combinations of both locally coded and community codes to do parameter sweeps over various spaces in their domain, and they've been very successful in using parallel scripting to basically leverage resources that were really unavailable to them earlier. So like, for example, the Open Science Grid, Exceed resources, ALCF resources are now being used, again, in this sort of parameter sweep kind of manner. Similarly, the field of protein structure prediction and protein and biomolecule interaction prediction has benefited a lot from parallelized workflows. So now increasingly at the University of Chicago and many other places, people doing protein structure prediction are, for example, using simulated annealing Monte Carlo-based approaches to study the physical models of protein biophysics. So these approaches, again, yield sort of these nested combinations of flow. In the middle of this chart is some work done at PNNL on subsurface modeling. And this is an example of taking fairly complex MPI codes and stitching those MPI codes into a workflow in the manner that I alluded to at the beginning, that the individual items in the workflow they don't have to be just serial codes, they can be parallel codes in a variety of models. Okay, and the target resources of these communities is diverse. And this is a challenge, because the challenge here is to find programming models that help the scientist to move across these levels of computation, to knit them together into the same workflow, and to try to find programming models that kind of transcend the differences between these diverse systems, going from the parallel resources on your desktop or laptop up through cloud resources, local cluster resources, and then HPC resources at both local centers and leadership centers. So going from handling say the growing number 1632, 128 cores that are available on a single node, all the way up to the many 100,000 to low million cores that are available on extreme scale systems is quite a challenge. And this also brings to light the diversity of the interfaces that need to be used to get to these kinds of resources. Like cloud stacks to do provisioning of cloud resources are very different than the kind of clusters you talk to run jobs on a local or leadership class supercomputing. So these are all problems, and the other challenge in this available diversity of resources is to create workflows where the right things run on the appropriate resources. So you may have a lot of situations where you have a portion of your workflow that is highly parallel and could really benefit from a leadership class machine, but then you have preparatory stages and summarization stages that really would be better run on local resources or dynamically provisioned cloud resources. And you also have situations where you may be running on, say, a local cluster, but your resource needs fluctuate drastically, as does the availability of resources on the cluster. So you may have a lot of need to sort of say, take cloud resources and strap them onto your local supercomputing resources to either meet your fluctuating demands or to meet fluctuating availability. So over at Argonne, we have an advanced light source called the Advanced Photon Source that is the site of a vast array of scientific experimentation. And every sector of this large light source has different experiments going on at different times. But there's a lot of commonality in terms of the need to take data emerging from the detectors on your experiment, rapidly determine if your experiment is set up correctly by doing a computational analysis of your early results. And then as your session on the light source proceeds, being able to kind of summarize what you've collected to date, see if it's matching the models that you are predicting or evaluating, compare it to simulation results, and then to basically reprocess your entire collection of results as your code or algorithms or parameterization changes. Sometimes by running sweeps and realizing that your model is off, and sometimes by using companion simulations that are running alongside of your experimentation and interacting with each other in the sense that the simulation is informing the experiment and data coming out of the experiment is recalibrating the parameters of the simulation. So this is essentially a very dynamical workflow kind of situation where we have the need to move data often to diverse resources, has a lot of fluctuation in the demand of a given workflow setting. So in other words, the demand early on in an experimentation session is for very rapid real-time confirmation that your instrument calibrations are correct. And later on, you have sort of more of a high throughput kind of mode where you want to be able to fully process and reprocess all the data you've collected. So this leads to environments like this where we have the need for high performance data movers, like you heard in previous lectures about Globus and its software as a service approach to doing data motion, and of its evolving structure for capturing the metadata of a simulation. So that's all in the cloud on the left. On the upper part of the slide, you see the data emerging from the APS into a capture host that's very close to the detector in your experimental setup, and then the flow of data through different levels where I might have a local cluster very close to my data inside the APS to do those initial skims of the data and the validation of calibrations, and then later on moving the data down to larger scale resources or to opportunistic resources. So all of these, this kind of complex resource setup combined with the complexity of this kind of experimentation process, places a lot of demands on data. So I'm going to basically summarize, by way of saying that the diversity of the different patterns that arises in workflow and the diversity of the different resources involved is kind of has basically given us a motivation for trying to express this kind of problem at a higher level. So sort of to just kind of briefly walk through what's being done today. We talked about MPI being used as a workflow programming language in some regards, and there's actually one aspect to MPI programming that I'd like to sort of call out in particular for workflow, and that is the notion of an evolving set of load balancing libraries. So there are load balancing libraries like Scioto and Tassel and the asynchronous dynamic load balancer that came out of Rusty Lusk's work at Argonne. And what these models are doing is essentially giving us a higher level task-oriented model above the MPI layer that makes it easier in many cases to express the tasking involved in a many-task computation. But they typically stop there in the sense that they basically address how do I generate and handle and consume tasks within an application structure, but they really don't give us a very high-level programming model to express the data flow dependencies between those tasks. So MapReduce is the beginnings of a pretty high-level model for doing this kind of processing, but it's actually, as its name indicates, it's actually pretty restrictive in the sense of, it's really focused and works best on data that can be expressed as textual records with keys, in a sort of a natural key value nature to the data. And it really doesn't give you a very good way to generalize, your application programming needs. So for example, a scientist who looks at the world through the application tools of their domain really, has a hard time figuring out how to map like a workflow that coordinates, say, BLAST and molecular docking with the name-value paradigm of MapReduce. So there's sort of an impedance mismatch between having to execute scientific tools on data sets that typically, come from and go to large files that are often structured data sets themselves, like HDF files or NetCDF files and things like that. And there's really no very good way, even though there's been a couple of attempts of having to do scientific programming in MapReduce, you're still very limited by the sort of constraining nature of that model. Okay. Another way of doing another programming model that I've alluded to many times is sort of the ad hoc model. In other words, taking ordinary tools and stitching them together with sort of limited parallel capabilities, like doing parallel processing via shell. And now we're starting to see better support for that kind of model in, say, Python and IPython, that has the beginnings of a reasonable kit for doing remote distributed parallel computing. But even there, when you're talking about doing a data flow diagram, you're kind of left with a network data flow library where you have to sort of explicitly add tasks to a graph and basically form a graph explicitly and then use that to drive your computation. So, we've talked a little bit about tools for doing this. I mentioned Condor as being the basic, founder of the high throughput computing model. Condor is basically driven by this, bag of tasks approach. It has a task-oriented task-oriented workflow description language called DAGMAN, in which you can explicitly program all of your task dependencies and then explicitly insert the data movement steps needed to drive those tasks. And then Pegasus is a pretty powerful framework for taking a higher level description of your workflow and mapping it to a Condor DAG. So Pegasus is data aware and actually will insert for you the data movement steps necessary to execute your DAG. So there's a growing set of languages. So Dryad and Seal are two of them that take the idea of embedding data flow in a traditional programming language. But these languages, they're kind of nice, pure languages, but they don't readily support the execution of scientific applications. In other words, they're not geared, they're sort of geared for nice data flow on in-memory problems, but not so much for calling out to scientific applications and orchestrating their execution on cluster resources. So Swift is, and that in particular is the niche that the Swift language addresses, which is the idea that the language is built from the ground up to express the flow of data and the sequencing of execution of scientific apps. Okay, and Hadoop we've talked about a little. Spark is an evolving model that's generating a lot of excitement. That's basically taking a sort of advanced in-memory approach to specifying MapReduce workflows. And Zookeeper and Uzi are Apache tools that sort of wrap around traditional MapReduce and start to bring the notion of data flow into that space by allowing you to do a sequence of MapReduce operations and giving you sort of a DAG-based way to express those. Okay, GNU Parallel is certainly an evolving, powerful tool if you're going to do the ad hoc shell scripting approach to workflow, then GNU Parallel is a nice way to take those parallel stages, and certainly for local execution gives you a nice way to sequence a set of tasks through available local cores. It has limited support for going out to other clusters, but its bread and butter is really sort of going into a shell script and allowing you to run a single stage of parallel processing. Okay, and then there's sort of a growing set of languages in Python, Java, in MATLAB. There's the parallel system for Octave and MATLAB, PSOM, that also is very explicit task graph oriented. So in PSOM, you basically, again, sort of like the networks interface in IPython, you stitch together the elements of your task graph manually. Okay, and then lastly, as I've alluded to, there's a large set of tools that allow you to graphically draw workflows and then typically translate into some kind of usually proprietary internal workflow management mechanism. So Galaxy seems to be about the most popular of these, and it's got a user community that numbers probably in the low 10,000 or so users, largely in the bioinformatics space, but sort of spreading out now to earth system science, to cosmology, many other sciences. And this is in part with collaboration with Argonne and UChicago scientists that have been taking Galaxy and extending it to new domains. And I think what we've learned from looking at the Galaxy community is that the single biggest driver for the adoption of a workflow system is the rich libraries that you could get by using that system. So for example, Galaxy has flourished because it's got a set of built-in tools that the practitioners in bioinformatics can just walk up to, see tools they understand, already knowing how to use them, can sort of drag and rearrange them on the screen, and it can specify the sequence of execution, nicely record the history of execution, and things like that. So this combination of a sufficient critical mass of community tools inside a workflow system is really proving to be one of the key mechanisms that lead to adoption. And here's a notion of Galaxy as envisioned at Argonne being enhanced by tools like Globus and Swift to do high performance data motion implicitly. And so what this work shows is basically the kind of marriage of a couple of different currents in workflow, the current of visual workflow with the current of powerful programmatic engines with high performance data movement as a service integrated together to solve that triad of problems of user interface, of scalability, and of data management. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about two fundamental problems in workflow scaling. And the first is basically as we go up to larger and larger machines and want to leverage those machines for workflow style computing, we're really confronted by the challenge of task rate. So for example, if I have 100,000 cores available for my problem, and I have a application code that runs in 10 seconds, and I want to run millions of instances of that workflow, I need 10,000 tasks per second to keep my 100,000 cores busy with work. Okay, so those kinds of task rates are very challenging to workflow systems. For example, in Condor systems, basically, we were very satisfied when we can get, sort of 10 tasks per second out of a engine that's used to sending jobs into other kinds of, traditional cluster resources and typically dealing with multi-hour jobs. When we're trying to do molecular docking and running, tasks that take only a few seconds, we're really in this new ball game of how do we, create the engines to do this kind of stuff. And similarly, data management is an equally, if not more daunting challenge on large-scale systems, because what we're trying to do is reuse existing codes, and hence we are, tightly bound to file system activity, yet the file systems that we're using on extreme scale machines are really oriented toward the rapid parallel reading and writing of single or small numbers of very, very large files. And they're not at all oriented toward sort of the stresses that a workflow load will place on those systems. So for example, the notion of having to create thousands of files per second on a shared file system that has multi-node integrity is a pretty daunting problem. And so workflow practitioners are always challenged with kind of the classic MapReduce problem, which is how do I make my file I/O as local as possible to the compute node? In other words, I have to really reduce the stresses that I'm putting on big shared resources and take as much advantage as I can of the parallelization of lots of little local file systems as opposed to very big shared file systems. Okay. And then, so to deal with the first problem, the tasks problem, in the workflow space, we typically are doing a concept called pilot jobs, which is basically putting a small agent on every compute resource and creating a fast way for the workflow distributor, the workflow interpreter, so to speak, to send tasks out to those distributed resources. So pilot jobs have been implemented by a wide variety of systems. And these pilot job systems are now bringing us into the realm of being able to do a few thousand tasks per second from a given workflow. So these are kind of instrumental in solving the tasking problem. And some of these pilot job mechanisms, because they now have network connections to every compute node in a complex or in a resource provisioned allocation, they can also do lightweight data transfer directly to that compute node and sort of bypass a lot of the complexities of traditional file transfer. Okay, so where are challenges? Challenges are in the diversity of the interfaces that we have to deal with in the systems environment that workflow systems are need to run on. The notion of the interlanguage dependencies that we see, because workflow almost by its definition involves integrating many kinds of languages in a single higher level application, and then dealing with very high performance networks, understanding the topology of what is underneath the implementation to a sufficient extent, and being able to hide that to a large extent from the end user to basically allow scientists to think in terms of just the pieces they want to connect and not the lower level details. Okay. So I'm going to basically segue with that into the approach that we've been doing in our group at Argonne and UChicago for approximately the last 7 years in a language called Swift that tries to address these challenges. Okay, so Swift is a high-level language, and it's basically a language for coordinating the execution of application codes, and it's a language that is really meant for programming in the large and to call this diversity of other languages that forms the scripting toolkit. So in other words, a Swift script is meant to basically orchestrate the execution of multiple application tools, shell scripts, and scripts written in this set of intermediate languages like Python, R, MATLAB. Okay? And its goal is to do 3 things for you: to basically give you a transparent way to express the parallelism in your code, to give you to automate the recovery of things that fail when you're running hundreds of thousands of tasks on thousands to hundreds of thousands of nodes or cores, and then to automate the data transport between the sites where you're computing at so that you can think in terms of the logical flow of your application and not worry about the physical minutia of moving data from node to node. So Swift is a functional language, and it's implicitly parallel. Okay, so we sometimes call this the implicitly parallel functional data flow programming model, in the sense that when you're executing a set of the body of a procedure, conceptually all the expressions in the body of every procedure run in parallel, which basically means recursively that your entire program can run in parallel, and expressions only block when the data objects that they're trying to consume are not yet available. So basically, this is using a concept called futures to drive the sequencing of execution. So in this simple example, function f and g they depend on independent parameters that came into this procedure. So once this procedure is invoked, as soon as I and j are set by some other calling procedure, functions f and g can fire, but the expression r equals f plus g blocks until those are ready. So that's kind of the core fundamental synchronization and programming model behind Swift. And it's taken sort of recursively through the language, and in particular, Swift the for each loop in the language is kind of the parallel workhorse. So it's basically, if you think in terms of MapReduce, for each is a simple way to express a mapping stage. So for every element in some array, some collection, in parallel, evaluate the body of the loop using, the member of that variable. So in this case, all of these convert steps to convert the objects in A are done in parallel. And I say conceptually because it's the runtime system that will throttle and map the execution of those codes to the available processors. Okay, so Swift has the basic expected simple set of data types, ints, floats, strings, and booleans. And it has a special data type called file, which is basically the fundamentals of this linkage between application codes and the files they produce and consume. And it's basically built on the idea that you take every program that you need to call within your workflow and write a function that expresses the files that go in and the files that come out of that function. And we'll see that in upcoming examples. Okay, so basically a file object is a mapping between a file that lives on the file system and a variable that lives in the workflow program namespace. Okay, and then data can be structured so you can actually write structs to define or to mimic or map what you see on the file system and then process that in your program. So again, it runs on any node in your environment. So it can run on a laptop or on a login host of a cluster, and it can send work to that cluster or to other clusters or to cloud resources, again, through this kind of pilot job mechanism that I mentioned earlier. So what you typically start off with in writing a Swift script is you have an application program, and you want to now give that application program a functional interface. So the application program is here in orange. The blue wrapper is meant to illustrate the function that you're defining. So for example, if I have a simulation program called psim that has some kind of command line argument to do protein structure modeling, I can write a Swift function called predict that takes in 2 floats and a file data type called protein, which represents a directory structure of a small set of files needed to describe a protein, and then process that and return the predicted protein structure as a PDB file, and a log file of its output. So in this simple example, what we're doing is we're taking a command line invocation of a function, and now, a command line invocation of a science application, and turning it into a function that can be then used to drive this functional data flow programming model. And then to run that function psim, or predict rather, I just use a normal functional notation. And so this simple approach allows that implicitly parallel data flow model to be used to drive and sequence the execution of ordinary application tools.
So the files that come out from psim are mapped onto structure and log, and they're accessible later on in the program?
Exactly right. Right. So and what the mapping there is that what's accessible is not the file's content, unless I actually go and do some kind of read operation in Swift, which is pretty rare. It's just a state indication that that file has now been produced and can be found on the file system at the place where we've mapped it to, so that the consumer of that file then can be, allowed to run, and that file can be transported, if need be, to the place where, the runtime system is selected for execution.
So would you launch this command or like the predict with you launch it from your laptop, you launch it from the front end?
Okay, so the question was, how does predict actually get launched here? So it's sort of there's a two-level answer. Within the Swift script, it gets launched right here when the function is invoked, okay? Now the Swift script itself is, looks like an ordinary functional program, a set of nested procedure calls, and it's invoked with the Swift command. So just like Perl or Python, you would run, if I say, Python, x.py, I would say Swift, myscript.swift, and then the Swift interpreter, starts interpreting this functional data flow and sends work out to the resources that you've defined. Okay, so another aspect to that is that Swift decouples the flow of your program from the definition of where those resources are, what drivers are needed to talk to them, and things like that.
And this app object, I could throw in qsubs or whatever match commands in. It just sort of prints that to a line?
Sort of. So the question was, where do the qsubs come from, essentially? So Swift actually does the qsubs for you. Okay, so the whole, in most cases, I should say, there's some exotic cases where you actually might want to program explicitly, your own qsubs and things, but the whole purpose of Swift is to hide details of qsub or SQ or SBatch or whatever, scheduler you happen to be running. Swift has a large set of drivers that know how to talk to those schedulers, and those are all hidden in the runtime system. Or I should say, not so much hidden, but separated into the runtime system. So we'll see shortly that in some of the examples we have, like we'll run on Tukey, and we'll see the little file that describes the attributes of Tukey being separate from the program workflow that we're going to run. And Swift will be generating the Cobalt, qsub or CQsub, whatever it is for Cobalt in that case. Yeah. Any other questions while we're, yeah, please.
So in the bottom line there, does Swift understand then that it can return structure and log independently?
Yes.
And then,
well, I should say yes in some cases. In this particular case, it so happens that structure and log, both are going to depend on this application finishing. Okay, so these app functions are what we sometimes call the leaves of the programming graph, of the flow graph of your program. So Swift has to actually block until those are finished. But when you go up one level, to the higher level structure of your data flow program, there's actually very little explicit blocking, right? It's almost everything is done by waiting for these apps to complete, and that triggers, downstream execution.
and then the other question I had is, I mean, you said this is a functional programming language. and yet you seem to let people write intermediate, sequential code.
You mean like in here, for example, or
Well, not there though, but like back up, you had
like this, for example?
yeah, like that.
Okay. So this is actually looks like sequential code, but is actually interpreted totally by dataflow. Okay, so you could write a body of assignment statements, and they could actually execute in the inverse order in which you've written them. Okay, just because they're totally triggered by automated dataflow. Okay, so the other thing I should have mentioned is that all the variables in a Swift script are single assignment. They're write once variables. So that's one of the major semantics that we kind of borrow from the functional programming model, and it's that semantic that allows transparent parallelism. I think I saw some other hands. Yeah.
On a meta note, how are you guys dealing with the Apple Swift programming language?
We're not, actually. There's a link at the bottom. Well, so for people who don't know, about a month or two ago, Apple announced their new Swift scripting language, which is based on LLVM. It's actually from the creators of LLVM. And let's just suffice it to say there's a link at the bottom of the Apple Swift site pointing to our Swift. Apple was gracious enough to contact us, just before the announcement, so we knew it was coming. We got a huge amount of web traffic, but then now we also get a lot of questions saying, how do I get your Swift to run on my iPhone? So it's been a net positive for us. Although the languages have little to do with each other. Okay. So now with our for each loop, we can typically do this very easy expression of this kind of parallelism. So the for each loop really is kind of the workhorse of Swift. A typical Swift script is basically, in a sense, it's a bit like MapReduce in the sense that we do for eaches and then we summarize what was returned from the for each. And this kind of pattern shows up over and over again. And many Swift scripts are really nothing more than this. In other words, you'll have a lot of application glue code, and then you'll write 10 lines or so of Swift code to basically orchestrate the execution of parallelism. On the other hand, some Swift scripts, like the example I gave for climate data model analysis, all of those CESM diagnostic scripts are written in Swift, and those are thousands of lines long, and they were basically transcriptions of the C shell logic into Swift, and then Swift figured out what can be done in parallel. So in those cases, the graphs, so the graph structure of the program can be much more complex than these simple little for each loops. Okay, and so this parallelism is really ubiquitous through the programming model. So in this case, this was a real example of people at Chicago doing simulated annealing optimizations on top of protein structure prediction codes that they had written. So they had written codes in a combination of C and Python that basically did their domain logic, but then they expressed the outer level algorithms for their core protein structure search methods in Swift. So they had a model called Monte Carlo-based simulated annealing, MCSA, and they had a protein prediction model based on that called iterative fixing, which basically would do a large set of annealing runs, summarize, guide the movement of the protein's shape, based on those statistics, and then do that again and do many, many rounds of that, and do that on many different kinds of proteins together. So this lent to a very, nice high-level, set of logic to express those kinds of campaigns. So you could sort of say, if I have a set of proteins I want to do prediction on, and then I have a couple of nested sets of parameters that I want to explore the cross product of in a parameter sweep, then you just use nested for each loops, and Swift basically drives the inner parallelism in that kind of model. And then similarly in this functional MRI logic, you could take this sort of large data flow of many, many steps. And each of these nodes in this flow graph, by the way, is a science code from, in this case, it was from a application suite called AIR, Automated Image Registration from Lonnie at UCLA. And each of these applications has a complex command line and expects files in, files out, parameters to be specified. And this was all written and transcribed into Swift. And now what we get is this kind of flow graph expressed as a nice functional, functional program that basically you can look at the main logic and instantly see the flow through the different science codes. Now, when you look at the same kind of logic in a shell script, all of this is obscured by the minutia of shell programming and moving things and meticulously kind of shaping command line arguments. And similarly, this is nested in the sense that like reorient run is itself a Swift function. And so the iteration of this parallel level of the flow graph is just expressed as this for loop inside that function. Now here's an example in MRI was probably the best and maybe most driving motivator that forced us to try to use a struct-based approach to mapping what's on the file system. So like I mentioned earlier that an MRI experiment consists of runs that a single person going through an MRI scanner gets a whole set of volumes of that person's activity over the duration of some experimental tasks. Then a high-resolution anatomical scan is done of the subject so that the activity in these time domain things can be mapped to regions of the brain. And then this kind of goes upwards through the experimental process, and you can get 100,000 or more files in a given directory. And so being able to map them as Swift structures and then iterate over them with simple for loops was a big benefit in terms of expressivity of that kind of workflow. Okay. And then lastly, I should just mention that Swift has sort of the standard kind of pilot job architecture for allocating nodes. And Swift, the version of Swift that we mainly use in production today on smaller clusters, clouds, distributed resources is based on a Java engine called Karajan that was part of the Globus Java cog kit, the commodity grid kit. And Swift was basically built on top of that. One layer of Karajan gives us this ability to have remote workers automatically deployed on diverse sets of resources. So this pilot mechanism, which is internally called coasters inside Karajan, has the ability to go to a remote resource, automatically bootstrap the necessary Java and agent code necessary to deploy, talk to the scheduler on that local resource, and get nodes from it. So a lot of what we do in Swift is sort of built on that underlying infrastructure. And that mechanism kind of lets us, again, free the application writer from having to think about how to pack jobs onto the sets of resources that are out there. So Karajan does a pretty good job of taking the requests that are emerging dynamically as your workflow executes and packing it onto resources. Okay, so I'm going to close this part with with basically where we were in Swift several years ago when we had this kind of nice mechanism for expressivity, but as soon as we started talking to bigger supercomputers, as soon as we had to drive 10 to 20,000 cores with this model, we were sort of at our limits. So the Karajan mechanism we talked about could pump out maybe somewhere between 500 and 1,000 tasks per second. But for the things we wanted to do, to talk to 10,000, 100,000, 700,000 cores, that 500 tasks per second limit wasn't going to make it. So we embarked on a new implementation of Swift that sort of freed us from having to interpret the Swift program on a single node. So my colleague Justin Wozniak, I'm going to let Justin plug in here because he'll start telling you about this next generation of Swift. And this is actually what I think is of the most driving interest to the extreme scale community, because this was explicitly what we're asking here is, can we take what we believe to be an expressive way of doing workflow and now scale it up so that the systems we talk to can be larger and the tasks that we run can be smaller and more diverse, okay? So yeah, I'll take any number of questions while Justin's plugging in.
So it sounds like, based on the last couple of things you said, I could have one Swift thing running on maybe my laptop, and it SSHs or submits a job to my workstation, and once my workstation finishes, it takes that file and then submits a job to Mira?
It can, yes. So that would be a common way of doing it. And it does indeed, it can use SSH to reach remote machines. It's also can use Globus to get to things, or you can manually start pools that allow Swift to connect back to resources that were just created manually. So it has drivers to talk to clouds and virtually every popular cluster, Condor, PBS, Slurm, LSF, maybe a few more.
It's light enough that my laptop can manage
So you're,
running on all
again, your laptop, depending on connectivity, depending on task rate, and heavily dependent on where the data is. Okay, so Swift can pull the data from other places. So you could run from your laptop, but the data could be coming from a HTTP or grid FTP server, or from the local machine that you're running on.